The Victorian home was a place of sanctuary from the outside world, especially in the cities where dirt and disease hung in the air and danger stalked the streets. And thanks to advances in science, a whole host of products and services were promising to make life at home cheaper, easier, and more convenient. But they were also making life much more dangerous. For under the guise of family-friendly products, mass consumption was bringing killers into the very heart of the Victorian home. With the aid of modern science, I'll seek out the deadly assassins that hid on every floor.
Leaning too close to the fire and poof, they burst into flames.
I'll be revealing what the Victorians couldn't see inside their homes.
5 grams is sufficient to potentially kill a small child.
And showing the terrible injuries that were inflicted in the name of progress.
That could completely remove the skin from the hand and the arm.
Welcome back to the perilous world of the real Victorian home. Between 1800 and 1900, the urban population in Britain increased tenfold. London became the biggest industrial city in the Western world. City dwellers in houses like this were creating an unprecedented demand for mod cons as well as life's necessities. They were becoming mass consumers at the end of a production line. Supplying the household with basic foods in the newly expanded cities of up to 3 million people was a strategic challenge. But thankfully, by the late 19th century, the staples of bread and milk had become cheaply available. To cater for the new demands, the Victorians pioneered new food processing techniques. This left the consumer at the mercy of the unscrupulous merchants responsible for each part of the food chain.
One thing that the Victorians loved above all was profit, and the way to make profit, of course, is to use the cheapest ingredients and charge a high price for them. So adulteration became very popular throughout the Victorian period.
Some merchants would substitute real ingredients with cheap alternatives that would add weight and increase profit margins. Food adulteration had always gone on, but the new manufacturing process meant it was now big business.
The food shops themselves change as well, so you used to have a system whereby, for example, with bread, the miller was the same as the baker, was the same as the retailer. Now, the miller mills the flour, passes it to the baker bakes, and the retailer sells. So you've got divorcing all the way along the chain. That depersonalises the food chain. People don't have the personal relationship with their customers, therefore they think they can get away with it. Anything that is made, manufactured, or passes through the hands of somebody who can adulterate it, by the mid-Victorian period, the chances are it will be adulterated.
These additions were astounding. Chalk, iron sulfate, and even plaster of Paris. But for many, buying processed foods released them from the drudgery of baking, was time-saving, and above all, was affordable. Bread was particularly susceptible to tampering, as many things could be disguised in it.
The biggest adulterant at the time was alum, and that's been used since the 18th century. It's a whitener. What it does is it enables you to take seconds or middlings or the lower grades of flour, make them look whiter.
Alum is an aluminium-based compound, often found today in detergent. But when hidden in bread, it not only makes it whiter, but retains water, so the bread feels more substantial.
In theory, the amounts used were quite small, and in theory, they were not particularly dangerous to health. But when you've got both the miller adding alum and then you've got the baker adding alum as well, then you start to build up the dose to levels where it really will affect your bowel system.
Food historian Annie Gray has prepared 3 loaves for me to illustrate the choice I would have had as a Victorian housewife. Whilst one loaf is pure, 2 of them have plaster of Paris, alum and other undesirables added to them.
And which is which?
Well, you're the Victorian housewife, so I would say you're in the baker's and you're presented with these loaves. Which one would you pick?
Well, they all look very attractive, which is slightly worrying. It's really quite dense, though, isn't it? It's quite heavy. So listen to that. This one's still quite dense, but again, looks nice and smells really like rubber or something. Very odd. That smells fine. This is lighter. Smells more like bread that I'm familiar with. So, my guess is that this one is fine.
Yes, it is. Although it's interesting the way perception plays a role. Part of the reason that you're preferring that one, I suspect, is because we are predisposed now to like granary breads and things that look healthy. Whereas with your Victorian hat on, you should be looking for the bread that is whitest and therefore will impress your dinner guests.
So I would probably be looking not to go for something wholemeal that looks healthy today, but something like this.
Yes. In the Victorian period, people really want white bread. It's the current obsession with wholemeal, granary, beautiful artisanal loaves. Nothing. You want white bread. So alum is a whitener that's put in.
And which is which in terms of these two? Which is the one, what's got what?
This one is the alum-based one, and this one is the one with plaster of Paris and bean flour. From a baker's point of view, this one's brilliant because a third of the dry solids in this are not pure flour. So you're making a reasonable saving on even the sort of low-grade flour that you're using.
But this housewife's choice had dire consequences for the consumer.
If you were a worker eating 2 pounds of bread a day and not much else, when you consider that a third of what you're eating just won't benefit you at all, you can see why chronic malnutrition is such an issue. And when your adulterants are things like plaster of Paris and alum, you can also see why chronic gastritis is a problem in late Victorian England. If you're in a workhouse and you're a 3-year-old, you're going to start off with constipation, you're then going to have irregular bowel movements, and then that will lead to diarrhoea. And if you are a 3-year-old in a workhouse and you've got chronic diarrhoea, that will lead to death.
Another reason for adulteration was a desire to make food more attractive and appealing. Colour was a key component.
And so there were things like colourants. You might have something like lead chromate, which is a very vivid yellow colour. In fact, it's the yellow that's used in the paint of American school buses. It's that really bright yellow. And that was put in things like mustard to give it an authentic mustard colour without having to actually include too much of the real ingredient, which was expensive.
Tea is adulterated with everything, from iron filings to dust to used tea leaves, and then black lead to make it look black. Green tea has Prussian blue in it. I mean, they're pretty lethal.
Sir Arthur Hill Hassall, a London-based physician, identified adulteration in 2,500 products and published his results in The Lancet. This led to the first wave of legislation in 1868.
The food adulteration laws were not very strong when they were initially put in, and they were not particularly effective either. People simply continued because it was very difficult to police, it was very difficult to prove.
And even after it is known about, even after Ackham and Hassall start to publicise the food adulteration, people just simply don't know what adulterated food looks like versus non-adulterated food. So you might know that your bread is probably adulterated, but either you don't have a choice or you just assume blithely that it happens to other people.
Bread adulteration might ultimately kill you because of malnutrition, but there was a greater, more immediate danger that was part of every child's diet. For the Victorians, milk was a cheap and important source of calcium, a healthy food, it was thought. However, in 1882, 20,000 milk samples were tested and revealed that 1/5 had been adulterated. A clue as to what was going on came from the domestic goddess of her day, Mrs. Beeton.
The Victorians sought advice on all manner of things, and when it came to food, Mrs. Beeton was their guru. According to the 1888 edition of her Book of Household Management, milk, she said, could be purified by preparations of which the principal constituent is boracic acid. And, she adds, it is said that most of the milk that comes to London is treated in this way. She concludes, fortunately for the consumer, it is a quite harmless addition.
But was it as harmless as Mrs. Beeton believed? Microbiologist Matthew Avison has devised an experiment that tests Mrs. Beeton's advice. Boracic acid was a component of a product called borax, an alkali which was used during the Victorian period to prolong the life of milk.
This milk doesn't taste very nice, so you would throw it away. The Victorians would say that's a waste, so let's do something to it that removes the sour taste. And what they would have done is added alkalis.
When fresh, milk has a neutral pH measurement of around 7. But over time, as it sours or spoils and becomes contaminated with bacteria, it becomes more acidic and its pH measurement drops.
So the Victorians worked out, probably by trial and error, that if you add alkali to this, it would neutralise the acid. Then I've calculated that that will neutralise the acid in this milk. So we just give it a little bit of a shake, and then we'll show, hopefully, that it gives a pH closer to neutral. So you can see this has gone back to 6.6, which is approximately neutral. It's neutralised the acid. It's now made this milk palatable again.
This new wonder alkali, sold in the shops as borax, was so popular it became a staple of the Victorian larder. But alarmingly, borax wasn't only used to treat milk. It was also marketed as a wonderfully versatile product, as I found when I read the journals of the time. I'm just looking at these ads in the Sketch from 1893, and there's this absolutely extraordinary one-page ad, Californian household treasure. It says it's absolutely pure and absolutely safe. It possesses qualities that are exceptional and unknown to any other substance, and it purifies water, destroys bacteria, it promises everything. In fact, borax promised too much. As well as purifying milk, it was brilliant at cleaning your bath and your loo. So what happened when borax ended up in the body?
Borax, or sodium borate, if inhaled or ingested, can cause severe irritation. So if it's swallowed, it can cause abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. If you have a large amount of it, it will start to affect other organs like the brain and the kidneys. And if you have enough, it can prove fatal.
But just how much borax is harmful?
I've added a small amount of borax to neutralise the acid in this milk, but of course if you had a pint of milk, you'd need more borax. So I calculated that you need this much borax to neutralise a pint of milk that's gone sour. This is 5 grams, and according to some people, 5 grams is sufficient to potentially kill a small child.
So the addition of borax was not as harmless as Mrs. Beeton suggested. Enough of it could kill. But by reducing the acid in the spoiled milk and disguising the sour taste, borax was concealing another deadly threat.
The real problem is it doesn't get rid of the bacteria, the underlying cause of the acid, and those bacteria could still kill people. Bacteria like Brucella, which causes undulating fever. It's a nasty fever that can go on for weeks at a time. That's not particularly lethal, but what would be lethal would be TB.
The bovine TB bacterium is present in cow's milk, and this was what was able to flourish undetected in the milk, with devastating effects.
Bovine TB. It's not the same TB that would cause the coughing symptoms that we associate with TB, but what's called non-pulmonary TB. It spreads out into the extremities, includes damage to internal organs, damage to the bones, and particularly problematic in children.
What other effects could drinking milk contaminated with the bovine TB bacterium have?
Bovine TB could also cause damage to the bones and the spine. For example, it could cause an abscess in the bones of the spinal column, which would soften the bone, which would then collapse to form a wedge shape. And if several of these vertebrae collapsed at once, it could cause massive deformity of the spine. This woman was actually particularly lucky because her TB damaged only the bones of the spine and not the spinal cord itself. If the abscess had tracked and burst backwards into the spinal column, it would have compressed the spinal cord and caused paralysis at best or death at worst.
Effectively purifying this according to the standards of Mrs. Beeton is like removing the biohazard tape, and now it's basically pot luck as to whether we have something that's contaminated and could kill us, or something that's not contaminated and is safe to drink.
Adding borax to milk allowed bovine TB bacteria to grow undetected, exposing a generation to a lethal infectious disease.
It's estimated that virtually all children were exposed to bovine TB at some time during their upbringing, and it's known that many of those children succumbed to that infection.
So you're saying that hundreds of thousands of people, mostly perhaps children, died as a result of that?
There are many studies, one of which, for example, was a series of post-mortems done in London in the 1890s, and they did post-mortems on 1,300 children who had died. 30% of those children died as a result of TB, non-pulmonary TB. Almost certainly that came from milk. Now, if you extrapolate that up, it's considered likely that 500,000 children died of TB from milk during the Victorian era.
Despite these horrendous deaths, the purification of milk with alkali was not banned by legislation in the Victorian period, and the problem of adulterated food continued until gradually consumer pressure led manufacturers to advertise their wares as pure and unadulterated.
The next hidden killer lies not in the room, but between the levels of the Victorian house.
The dangers weren't just a result of products introduced into the home. They were built into the very fabric of the new Victorian houses. One of the most common death traps was right under their feet.
Stairs have always been dangerous. Even with today's building regulations, at least 300,000 accidents occur every year in the UK. But in Victorian times, it was even worse.
There's numerous accounts of people falling down staircases and breaking their necks, or breaking a leg and dying later of septicemia.
Why were there so many deaths and injuries from stairs? The finger points to the urban population boom. The number of Victorians per square mile increased from 390 in 1871 to 558 by 1901. Houses were thrown up and packed into smaller plots with little concern about regulation or standardisation.
The problem is the way that the house styles changed. Houses become very much more narrow. So what you've got is very high ceilings, 10, 11 feet, with a very narrow frontage. It's a straightforward geometrical problem, as if you've got 11 foot and only a very short space to get into it. The staircase has to be steep.
In middle-class homes, the stairs that were most likely to be cheaply constructed, to be the steepest and the narrowest, were those that led to the servant quarters.
Upstairs, downstairs came from the difference in staircases, from the decorated staircase, which was the main one in the house, which was there as a show of wealth. It was a statement to say, look, this is how much money I've got. As you came through the front door, and there's this wonderful double bullnose stairs, highly decorated with spindles and volutes and balustrades and goosenecks. You had people spending thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds on these staircases. And then the downstairs staircase was for the servants. It was built out of the cheapest softwood that you could possibly buy. You'd be lucky if there was handrails and spindles, rises of 9, 10, 12 inches. Safety really wasn't high on the agenda.
Tragic, really, because by 1847, visionary builder Peter Nicholson had calculated how to build a safer staircase, transforming the art of stair building into a science.
He came up with a mathematical formula for working out the rise and go of a staircase. He'd worked out that if you went up a certain height, you could travel a certain distance with great ease, and he developed a formula around that.
In order that people may pass freely, the length of the step ought never to be less than 4 feet. Though in townhouses, for want of room, the going of the stair is frequently reduced to 2.5 feet.
Nicholson's formula considered how someone could take a normal stride, yet still allow them to rise 6 to 8 inches with every step.
Until you get those factors right, then the stairs is always going to be a dangerous place.
There's a science to stair building, but in the rush to throw up houses, it was a science that was often overlooked in the late Victorian period.
I've come to Manchester Metropolitan University to see what modern science can tell us about the dangers of the Victorian stairs. I've been wired up to a motion capture device which will track every step I take to find out how my body adapts to the stairs. Professor Kostas Manganaris
OK, so I'm just going to clip you into the harness.
And Professor Neil Reeves are experts in biomedical research and are going to demonstrate 2 staircases.
We'd like you to go to the top of the staircase, stand facing this way, and just walk down at your own comfortable speed, as you would normally.
This first staircase has been set to dimensions similar to a main Victorian staircase, following Nicholson's principles. The going, or width, of each step has been set to 11 inches, and the height, the rise, to 12.5 inches.
Well, apart from all the get-up, it felt pretty easy coming down those stairs. I'd feel pretty happy running up and down those, no problems at all.
Now they set the stairs as they might have been in the servants' quarters.
Forwards one.
This definitely breaks Nicholson's formula,
Yeah, OK, we'll leave you there.
with the going narrower and a steeper rise.
So can you walk down as you would normally?
Predictably, this is not comfortable at all. In fact, I'm really having to slow down, change the way I take each step, and hold the handrail. Imagine if I had to carry a tray or the linen and couldn't see where my foot fell because of a long skirt.
If we measure your foot, this is about 26 centimeters, which is much larger than the 17.5 centimeters room you had.
I had to turn it sideways.
You decided to turn it sideways.
Well, otherwise, one's foot's coming off the edge.
Otherwise, what would happen, an important part of the foot would come out of the edge, and then you would have an increased likelihood of encountering a slip.
Yes, yes. And I've fallen downstairs before, so I was very conscious of not wanting to do it.
Absolutely.
From the data input, the scientists reveal that on the servants' staircase, we are 6 times more likely to fall than on the ground one. It may seem obvious that a steeper staircase would be more dangerous, but there was another hidden danger. Many Victorian homes were built with non-uniform steps. This video of a New York subway stairs illustrates what happens when one stair out of 16 is a fraction of an inch higher than the others. Professor Jake Pauls, a specialist in stair safety, studied the stairs and worked out that this tiny change has a dramatic impact on the misstep and fall incidence that is not equated to any other stair defect. In other words, you're more likely to fall if the stair is not uniform than for any other reason.
What is it about that video? What does it tell us?
Well, I think what it tells us is that people get used to a very regular stair pattern very quickly, so after a few steps. And if all of a sudden you introduce a step which is very different, it poses difficulties for people. And this is why it's more likely to for someone to have an accident or to slip on that irregular step.
So if you'd given me 2 that were the bigger ones and then a smaller one, I almost certainly would have fallen down.
Exactly.
Thank you for not doing that.
By disregarding Nicholson's formula, the Victorians' new staircases, installed in many of these narrower houses, had unwittingly combined high rises, narrow goings, and uneven steps to create a grave hazard for the servants.
With the extra weight of carrying trays and food, there's no way that they could get up and down those stairs in one piece. Total death traps, absolute death traps.
Stairs remain one of the most common sources of accident and death in the home. To understand our next set of dangers, we need to appreciate one of the major preoccupations of our Victorian forebears.
It was at this time that cleanliness was becoming powerfully linked to ideas of morality and respectability, and this is reflected in the literature of the period. Charles Kingsley's novel The Water Babies epitomises it because it suggests you could take a dirty boy off the street and transform him into a model gentleman through the cleansing power of water. It sums it up in the last lines. They say, "Meanwhile, do you learn your lessons and thank God that you have plenty of cold water to wash in, and wash in it too, like a true Englishman."
The Victorians were totally and utterly obsessed with being clean. For them, cleanliness was truly next to godliness. They were setting themselves against the 18th century, which was a time of dirt, which was a time in the upper classes that perfume was used to disguise dirt. The Victorians believed that a clean heart, a clean body, meant a clean soul.
It was this desire for cleanliness that would lead the Victorians to embrace a whole new range of potentially deadly innovations and products.
One of the rooms the Victorians can claim to have invented is the bathroom. And what surer sign of progress than a private room in which to carry out one's ablutions?
The bathroom really appears primarily because running water comes into the home for the first time. So if you can actually bring water into the home, it becomes more practical to have a room dedicated to its use.
Until the mid-Victorian period, hot tubs for bathing had stood next to the fire in the front room or kitchen, where water had to be warmed and poured into them.
This means that servants no longer have to be sort of traipsing up and down the back stairs carrying large amounts of water. And I think this is when the bathroom, as we know it, as a sort of separate, private, lockable space away from the rest of the house, really starts to take shape.
What the Victorians hated most of all was the idea of bodily fluids, the kind of smells they made, the kind of traces they left. They wanted to expunge them entirely from the body so that no one can smell the traces of these fluids that link you to the working classes.
So where does the collection come from? Well, mostly it's given to us by different people.
And what happened happened in this private lockable space could be incredibly dangerous. I've come to Blaise Castle in Bristol to meet curator Catherine Littlejohns. I want to get some idea of the inventions available to the Victorians who sought to meet these new high standards of cleanliness.
Oh, wow. We're just going to look at some of the baths in the collection. I'm going to show you one of my favourite things. It's actually a gas-powered bath. So if we have a look at the underneath here, you can see where the gas went in at the front here, and then just around by you there's a little door, which is where you would light the gas.
OK, so here you'd put in your lighted match or whatever.
Yeah.
Gosh, so that's actually ridiculously dangerous, isn't it? Doesn't it mean that you can boil yourself in your bath?
You very probably could do. The instructions, the guidance always says they're very careful to point out that you don't want to actually start turning the gas on until you've actually got some water in the bath, so you don't boil it dry. They don't really make a mention of making sure you don't get into the bath while the gas is on.
The desire to be clean meant that the bath's popularity outpaced any concern about the dangers, which were significant. The papers regularly reported cases of scalding so serious they resulted in death. It wasn't until the invention of the thermostat, safe for gas, and its installation that these risks would be addressed. This new room, with its cutting-edge innovations, would bring even more killers into the home.
I think they were trying to understand the dangers of electricity and water and gas and all these new services coming into fairly small, confined areas without really understanding the dangers of how they actually interact with each other.
What could be better or more desirable than having a loo that flushed? But its introduction was not without problems. The first danger lay in the plumbing.
Early plumbing in Victorian houses, the sewer systems didn't efficiently drain away the waste.
Gases such as methane and hydrogen sulfide emanating from human waste would not be able to escape and would build up in the sewer.
Both of these gases are not only flammable, but they're also explosive.
What always used to happen was the sewerage outlet would get blocked and somebody would have to go and figure out how to clear it to get it to actually run away free. At the time, there wasn't electric batteries, torches and stuff like that, so the only way you could actually go and investigate it was unfortunately with a naked flame.
Not only could gas collect in the sewer, methane could actually leak back into the house itself.
It's quite a common occurrence, there's that outlets of toilets to spontaneously combust. And that was really where the drive towards improvements in drainage actually came from, because they needed to stop methane getting back into the houses.
And it was one of Britain's most famous inventors that helped put a stop to this potential killer with one small but crucial component.
Thomas Crapper, even though he gets a lot of good press about inventing the toilet, he actually invented the siphon valve, which is actually a water trap and a valve flap which actually stops methane coming back into the property, so it couldn't ignite. It didn't stop the problem down in the main sewers, but it stopped it actually affecting the people who lived in the house.
Not only were Victorian bodies subject to a new regime of washing and scrubbing, but what they put on them was too. Wealthy Victorians, both men and women, could change their clothes up to 5 times a day.
By the late Victorian period, laundry had become a huge operation because clothing was not simple. There was an extensive amount of clothing, even for a child, and certainly for a woman. She wore a lot of underclothing, a lot of linen, and these had to be changed regularly. The Victorian mistress had a constant battle against her greatest enemy, which was dirt.
The Victorian house could not escape the pollution of the time. In London, for instance, the manure of the 100,000 working horses, the pervasive smog, and the smoky gas lamps in the home all took their toll.
Victorian wash day was quite a mammoth task. I mean, you washed the clothes on the Monday, you dried them on the Tuesday, and you would be ironing them on the Wednesday, so a large part of your week would be taken up by the wash.
Doing the laundry was an expensive business and a major part of the household budget. For those who could afford it, a laundress could be hired in by the day. It was a military-style operation.
Every Victorian middle-class woman came to her marriage with great trunks full of white clothing, linen, and her big job throughout her marriage was keeping those just as brilliantly white, and what she used in this endeavour were soaps, disinfectants, and most of all, she used the mangle.
So I've just fed this in from the back here, and you just have to get it so that it's between the rollers.
Bringing out heavy fabrics sodden in boiling water became easier with the arrival of the mangle.
It's not too heavy because of the gear system, and of course this is dry, so if you were doing it with wet clothing...
But of course this brought its own perils.
But why is it so dangerous? I mean, it seems really quite solid.
I think it's probably like a lot of Victorian contraptions where, yes, it is very solid, but you've got kind of exposed gear wheels and things, and obviously you have to feed the clothing in. And what you have to remember is that the lady of the house, she would have been doing this with young children around. Her daughters would have been watching her because they needed to learn how to work these things, and often probably in quite a confined space.
Oh, the dangers of little fingers, I mean, you know.
Possibly.
The injuries incurred by wash day mangle accidents were horrific and sometimes fatal.
Oh, a mangle could do an awful lot of damage, particularly to a child, and of course it was typically children who would put their hand out of curiosity into the mangle. Obviously, the hand, the arm, and it typically was the upper limb that was caught, would be compressed and everything in it would be squashed, and a significant proportion would have fractures of the bones as well as damage to the soft tissue. There was a shearing force where you were pulling the skin in opposite directions, and that could completely remove the skin from the hand and the arm and tear it all away to reveal the muscles and tendons underneath.
Mr. Barham, surgeon, found the child pale, pulseless, and partially paralysed, and with the parental bones on either side of his head smashed in.
The dangers of the mangle might seem obvious to us now, but our next hidden killer was impossible to see both then and now.
Things couldn't just look clean. The new science of germs and microbes was changing ideas of cleanliness, from tackling the visible to the invisible. Dangerous germs, they feared, could lurk hidden from sight and needed to be eradicated.
Until the late Victorian period, many believed that diseases were caused and carried by bad air. But with improvements in technology and the emergence of high-powered microscopes, bacteria began to be identified as the cause of disease. But this science was brand new and not easily understood by the general public.
There are various theories around the origins of disease at this point. They're quite confused about it. They've started to be aware of germ theory, but this isn't fully understood yet.
What they did understand was that there were microbes all around, invisible to the eye, but everywhere. And this made the Victorians disproportionately fearful and easily spooked.
Some mothers didn't want to kiss their children because they thought it would spread germs. So this is very real and comes up again and again in diaries. The fact that people were afraid of each other because of germs, which is a horrific thing when you think about it.
As this climate of fear escalated, so people became increasingly alarmed about all manner of little things.
One of the most important things apart from germs was flies. The great fly scare of the 1890s.
The Great Fly Scare was caused by public awareness of the speed with which flies could spread germs. Flies were everywhere, living off the horse manure and trampled into the home. Once scientists identified flies as carriers of disease, the public reacted.
They realised that one of the main communicators of germs were probably flies, with their little sticky feet walking over everything. And once you started to look at flies like that, they became objects of horror.
The terrors of insects and moths and caterpillars that need to be sternly exterminated because they just show the natural world coming into your perfect home.
Also, skirts. Not strictly speaking anything to do with flies, except if you noticed when you walked around with a long skirt on, that you would be brushing up against the feces and the horse manure and everything else. And that was likely to bring fly eggs in or anything. So skirt length went up to ankles.
Once skirts went up, the shutters came down on flies in the home, with a variety of products invented to stop them.
You have fly screens, you have little lace doilies over your milk jugs, you have little lace doilies everywhere, really. You cover your curtains with lace to stop flies coming in, not really so that you can not see out. All of these things were partly to do with the fly scare.
But the fight against germs would require more than beaded doilies. The Victorians needed to believe that these germs were being eradicated by newly invented products that would kill all known germs dead.
Many claims were made in the name of science before these items could be rigorously tested, making the late Victorian home a very scary place to be.
And the Victorians worshipped science, they worshipped invention, so they would do anything to make things cleaner, even if that meant using dangerous chemicals.
But as the incredible cleaning powers of these new items became more potent, so the dangers in the home increased.
The problem was that many cleaning products are toxic, and they have to be. That's how they have their cleaning effects. But they were stored and sold in very similar packages. So you would go to the shop and get a box that contained something like baking soda, which we would use to bake bread or cakes and is perfectly harmless, but it may look very similar to the box of caustic soda, which of course is very corrosive and would do a huge amount of damage to the body.
Dangerous chemicals such as caustic soda and carbolic acid were now in the cupboard next to the flour and sugar and were easily muddled. The opportunity for mistakes and mix-up between products was huge. Drinking bleach or carbolic acid, for example, would lead to an agonizing death.
The first thing that would happen would be a burning sensation in the esophagus because it is directly corrosive to anything that it comes in contact with. And so that would go down into the stomach and cause abdominal pain. In the early stages, if the person survives and they don't go into renal failure, they may develop strictures because of scarring of the esophagus, meaning that they're unable to swallow any food. And of course, that could prove fatal.
This lack of distinction in bottles and packaging of toxic cleaning materials and dangerous substances didn't just confuse the Victorian at home. There were cases where even professionals made mix-ups with disastrous consequences. On one occasion in Bradford, a chemist mistakenly mixed arsenic into his lozenge recipe, killing 12 people and rendering a further 78 seriously ill.
And so it was this problem with the packaging that really forced legislation to make packages much more distinct, so different shaped and sized and coloured bottles and boxes, so that you couldn't reach for the flour and pick up the arsenic, for example.
But it wasn't always an accident. Lethal poisons of all descriptions were easily and readily available over the counter. With this lay a new temptation, because poisoning could go undetected.
Victorian age was the age of the poisoner. The rise of arsenic was to many people a great opportunity. Previously, if you wanted to murder someone, you'd have to use your brute strength. You'd have to stab them or strangle them. When arsenic became widely available, there was a lot of comment in the newspaper saying, well, women could just slip it into their husband's tea, so why wouldn't they? They were absolutely afraid that all the women in Britain would turn poisoner, because why would you not murder your husband and go off and be a merry widow? Why not?
People bought poisons for things like rat poisoning and fly papers, so you could easily just go and buy them for completely legitimate reasons. The other reason was this is a time when life insurance became available, and so you could take out a life insurance policy on one of your family members, and then if they die, you could claim the money. And there's evidence there were quite a few unscrupulous people who took out large policies before people mysteriously died. There were many poisons around, things like arsenic, but probably the worst and the one that caused the most awful death was strychnine.
Strychnine could be used both as a medicine and in the garden as a pesticide. A white odourless powder, it was like so many other items in the cupboard.
It has very immediate and unpleasant effects. First of all, the muscles of the head and the neck would start to contract, and then spasm would spread to all the muscles of the body. The person would start to convulse, and at its worst, the muscles of the body would be so contracted that the person would be resting on just their heels and their head, with their back bowed in the middle and unable to move. Death would follow rapidly, either because of paralysis of the respiratory muscles, which meant that they couldn't breathe, or exhaustion following all these awful convulsions.
Demand had never been higher, and manufacturers had never sold so many poisonous products. It would take a long time for that to change.
It wasn't until just after the Victorian age, in 1902, that the Pharmacy Act required that bottles of disinfectant be distinguishable by touch from bottles in which ordinary liquids were contained.
In order to find the next hazard, we must first understand the temptations on offer to the middle-class Victorian.
Could this be a hidden killer? Manufacturers began to woo a burgeoning mass market. This was the first age of mass advertising. Back in the 1850s and 1860s, it had been thought ungentlemanly to advertise. Now, for the first time, advertising became powerfully visual. Photography and art were used to sell goods. Advertising agencies were founded, and celebrities started to endorse products.
There's an expansion in print culture. There are more newspapers, there are more magazines, but there are also new technologies and ways of producing images and putting them in them. For example, photographs appear in magazines from the 1890s onwards, and this really means that advertising takes on a new visual form at this point, and I think it becomes more persuasive and more powerful.
The power of advertising put new pressure on Victorians and would lead to increased risks.
And these advertisements are particularly aimed at the upper class and the middle class woman. And what they're trying to say is, if you don't buy our products, if you don't use our products, you will be a failure as a housewife, as a woman. So they really played on insecurities. And what they did was they got everyone to buy all kinds of dangerous substances under the guise of perfecting your home.
And the perfect Victorian home wouldn't be complete without a dangerous new material, which they inadvertently welcomed into their homes in an amazing array of objects. The man who invented it was so famous at the time a letter bearing just his name and city would get to him.
Mr. A. Parks, inventor of Parkazine, Birmingham. And it got there.
Birmingham, dubbed the City of 1,000 Inventions, had become a magnet for scientists. And it was here that Parks developed his revolutionary idea.
He took cotton wool, ordinary cotton wool, which he combined with acids and various things, and he discovered how to convert the material into a mouldable material, which we today will call plastic. So we reckon he's the father of plastics.
So we've sort of forgotten about this great British inventor, haven't we?
I know. He was a great inventor too. He had something like 90 patents to his name. Well, he wasn't a very good businessman because the company folded about 2 years later. But his idea was so good, it was picked up in the States by a guy called Hyatt. And Hyatt gave it the name Celluloid. And from then on, we've known it as celluloid. We've forgotten Parks, but we all know celluloid as an early material.
It was the Americans who developed it into a business success and started something of a revolution.
It wasn't until 1885 that the world's first really successful plastic product hit the streets, and it was something quite unusual. It was a celluloid collar and cuff, and there's a sociological reason for it, of course. Remember the clerks sitting at those high desks writing away in ledgers all day long, and they wouldn't be allowed to have scrap paper for calculations, so they made calculations on their cuff. Now, they couldn't afford a clean linen collar and cuff every day like their bosses, and they couldn't afford to launder them, so by the end of the week, they must have been chaotic, with numbers going left to right, right to left and backwards. But then along comes celluloid. You can do all the numbers you want on your cuff during the day, take it home at night, put it under the tap, rinse it, shake it dry, put it on again in the morning looking pristine, just like the boss. And it was an amazing sociological success all over the world, 1885.
For as these affordable celluloid products found their way into items all over the house, a terrible discovery was made.
It's a wonderful material, but it's not a perfect material because it's inflammable, it burns. Chemically, it's very similar to gun cotton, and gun cotton we know is an explosive material. So cellulose nitrate, Parkazine, celluloid, it burns very fiercely.
Ignoring its flammability, celluloid was such a useful material that canny manufacturers saw numerous opportunities to produce those must-have items.
When the invention of plastic allowed brooches, hair combs and mirrors to be as ornate and attractive looking as the much more expensive ivory, they were eagerly swept up. The middle classes wanted to look wealthy and modern, and these products allowed them to look just that.
This Victorian evening bag, for example, this looks like a piece of hand-carved ivory, and it's not, it's a piece of pressed celluloid.
It wasn't a real ivory comb, it was made of celluloid, and it wasn't a real wooden bath, it was painted like wood, and that's because the Victorians were so delighted by innovation and by science, and they loved the idea of tricking themselves, and also they loved the idea of a cheap bargain.
Maybe not such a great bargain.
I want to find out just how flammable celluloid really is. This is a ping pong ball from China. This is one of the few products in the world that you can still buy that's made of celluloid.
Assisting me is Martin Shipp from Building Research Establishment. Martin, the flame, please. Wow, a surprisingly fierce flame. Definitely not something to try at home. Martin estimates that celluloid is 5 times more flammable than plywood. Celluloid's chemical composition meant it could not only go up in flames easily, but it was also unreliable in other ways.
Over time it degrades. Light and chemicals can cause it to gradually break down. And in that breakdown process, it releases camphor and it releases alcohols and other things that are flammable. And those flammable gases in the atmosphere can then be ignited by a spark or a flame without anybody igniting the celluloid itself. That's what made celluloid so dangerous.
And there were other problems too. Celluloid items could also spontaneously combust, as this cartoon of the time illustrates. And billiard balls, traditionally made of ivory, were now made from the cheaper celluloid, until it was discovered that they would explode on impact.
This is an example of one of the very first billiard balls made from cellulose nitrate. And the inventor of this billiard ball had a letter from a Colorado saloon keeper that he didn't mind when the balls crashed together sometime. They got a mini explosion because it was an explosive material. But what he did object to was the fact that every man in the room turned around and pulled out a gun.
But even worse was to come. Celluloid was so versatile, it replaced materials like ivory and bone in clothing, items like corsets and lace, brooches, bracelets, and all sorts of accessories were either made of or featured celluloid, without concern for the accumulative effect.
This is a hair comb used in the 1890s, and the fashion and style was to have a hair comb pushed in the back. Not just one, but several of them. And when you consider that's a highly flammable material, and the reports of people passing too close to gas lamps or leaning too close to the fire, and poof, they burst into flames.
There were terrible tales of misadventure, like the woman who failed to notice a cigar roll under her celluloid-enhanced dress until it was too late.
She immediately ran outside to try and get away from the smoke. Unfortunately, that change in conditions from fairly restricted within a small area within a home to outside where there's a lot of oxygen and some wind, the skirt started to burn with flames, and she was immediately engulfed in flames.
In her pursuit of cut-price fashion, the Victorian woman had been transformed into a walking fire hazard.
Although in 1922 there was an act enforcing better safety in premises where raw celluloid film was stored, there was never any legislation to stop the use of celluloid in fashionable items and in clothing. It was only over the course of the 20th century, as more improved, less flammable plastics were invented, that the use of celluloid declined.
But while its introduction had been a dangerous one, it developed into a far safer product that is still with us. One that a British inventor had been responsible for.
I think you can look around today and virtually everything which you look at or touch or you control, everything you do involves plastics. It controls our lives today, which you may think is a good thing or a bad thing, but it does. We can't avoid that. And he set the wheels in motion for that. He laid the foundations for a massive industry which now controls and affects everybody's lives throughout the world.
From the food they ate, to the clothes they wore, and the gadgets and products championed by the new exciting advertising campaigns, Victorian homes were brimming with killers. They lay dormant until scientific progress, consumer concern, or a brave new pioneer raised their voice above the clamour and forced a change for the better. But the Victorian ideal of safe as houses was never really fulfilled.
Many of the domestic fatalities of late Victorian Britain can be explained by middle-class desires to make their lives easier, cheaper and more convenient, and to conform to ideals of morality and respectability. But we mustn't forget that they were pioneers, and progress always comes at a cost. As the century reached its close, Britain was leading the world and was on the verge of a golden age in which scientific advances would really start to make a difference. But would the Edwardian home be any safer?
Next time, I'll be discovering how a new century, a new monarch, and extraordinary new inventions would have an impact on the Edwardian home.
She covered her face in poison.
Absolutely lethal.